My name is Sophie Marsh. I'm 29 years old, and for 4 days, I was the only person who came to see my grandmother in the hospital after her stroke, while my mother and my 2 aunts stayed away, telling themselves and each other that there wasn't much any of them could do sitting in a hospital room. On the 4th night, when I thought she was too weak to speak clearly, my grandmother gripped my hand and whispered something that none of us saw coming: "Call my lawyer. Before I die. Tonight, if you can." Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever been the only one who showed up, while everyone else found reasons not to, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. My grandmother, Eleanor Marsh, is 83 years old, a woman who raised 3 children largely on her own after my grandfather died young, built a small but genuinely successful chain of dry cleaning businesses across our county over 4 decades, and has always carried herself with a specific, understated independence that I've admired for as long as I can remember. She lives alone, by her own firm choice, in the same modest house she and my grandfather bought when my mother was a baby, and until her stroke this past spring, she drove herself to her weekly bridge game, managed her own finances, and generally resisted, with quiet but unmistakable firmness, any suggestion from her children that she might need more help than she was asking for. I've always been close to my grandmother in a way that, I think, distinguished me somewhat from my mother and my 2 aunts, her other grandchildren spread across busier lives and greater physical distances. I live 20 minutes from her, work a flexible schedule as a freelance copy editor, and have spent a good part of the last several years stopping by regularly, Sunday dinners, help with tasks around the house, long afternoons where we'd simply sit together while she told me stories about building her business in an era when very few women did anything of the kind. I want to describe my grandmother's specific temperament a little more, because I think it matters for understanding both what happened during her hospitalization and what came after. She is not, by nature, a woman who complains easily or asks for help readily, a trait that I've come to understand, over the years, as both admirable and, at times, genuinely costly to her own well-being, since it meant that the people around her, including her own children, often underestimated exactly how much she was managing entirely on her own. I want to spend a little more time describing my grandmother's actual history, because I think the specific shape of her independence, and the specific reasons she came to value self-reliance so deeply, matter for understanding everything that happened later. My grandfather, Walter, died of a sudden heart attack when my mother was 11, Barbara was 9, and Susan was just 6, leaving my grandmother, then 34, with 3 young children and a small, struggling dry cleaning shop that Walter had run more as a hobby than a serious business. My grandmother told me, many times over the years, about the specific choice she faced in the months after Walter's death: take a steady, modest job somewhere and let the shop close, or throw herself into running it properly, learning a business she'd never been formally trained in, essentially from scratch, while also raising 3 children largely alone. She chose the second path, and the stories she told me about those early years, teaching herself bookkeeping at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, negotiating with suppliers who assumed, wrongly, that a young widow could be easily taken advantage of, slowly expanding from 1 location to eventually 4, always carried a specific, quiet pride that I found genuinely inspiring growing up. By the time she sold the business, in her early 60s, it had grown into a small but genuinely successful regional chain, providing her with a comfortable, self-made financial security that none of her 3 daughters, I think, ever fully appreciated the scale or difficulty of building. I mention all of this because I think it explains something important about why her eventual response to her family's absence during her hospitalization carried the specific character it did, not impulsive anger, but the same clear-eyed, deliberate practicality she'd applied to every difficult decision throughout her adult life. My mother, Diane, is the oldest of my grandmother's 3 children, followed by my aunts Barbara and Susan. I want to describe the general dynamic between the 3 of them and my grandmother honestly, because I think it's important context for what happened during her hospitalization, rather than something that emerged suddenly, out of nowhere, once she actually needed them. My mother and my grandmother have always had a somewhat strained relationship, a specific, long-running tension that predates anything in this story and that I don't fully understand the origins of, beyond general references, over the years, to disagreements during my mother's own young adulthood about choices my grandmother disapproved of at the time. My Aunt Barbara, the middle child, lives roughly 3 hours away and has, for most of my life, maintained contact primarily through holiday visits and occasional phone calls rather than any closer, more regular involvement. My Aunt Susan, the youngest, lives closest among the three, only about 40 minutes from my grandmother, but has always struck me as someone who treats her own mother's needs as a lower priority than the demands of her own busy household, 3 teenagers, and a husband whose various activities seem to consistently absorb whatever time and energy she might otherwise have available. I don't say any of this to suggest that my mother and aunts are fundamentally cruel or uncaring people. I think, in each of their individual cases, a combination of old, unresolved family tension, genuine busyness, and a persistent, perhaps convenient assumption that my grandmother's fierce independence meant she rarely truly needed anyone, had settled, over years, into a pattern of relatively minimal, low-effort involvement in her life, a pattern that none of them, I believe, would have described in those terms themselves, but that became undeniable once an actual crisis arrived and tested it directly. I want to describe, briefly, why I ended up occupying the specific position I did within this family dynamic, because I don't think it happened by accident, or purely out of some innate virtue on my part that my mother and aunts simply lacked. I've always had, since childhood, a specific closeness with my grandmother that I think stemmed partly from proximity. My mother and I lived only 15 minutes from her throughout most of my childhood, considerably closer than either of my aunts' households, and partly from a genuine, mutual temperamental fit between us that developed naturally over the years. I also want to be honest that my own life circumstances, at the specific moment of my grandmother's stroke, made the kind of sustained presence I provided considerably more feasible for me than it might have been at other points in my life. I'd left a demanding in-house editing position 2 years earlier to work freelance, a choice I'd made primarily for reasons unrelated to my grandmother, but one that happened to leave me with considerably more flexible time than my mother, tied to a rigid office schedule, or my Aunt Susan, managing a household of 3 teenagers, could readily access. I mention this not to diminish the significance of what I did during that difficult week, but because I think it matters for understanding the full picture, that circumstance and flexibility played a real role in why I was the one available to show up consistently, alongside whatever deeper, more personal closeness existed between my grandmother and me. I don't think my mother and aunts were incapable of finding the time, had they genuinely prioritized it. But I also don't want to pretend that my own presence during that week came from nothing but pure devotion, when practical circumstance clearly played its own significant part. My grandmother suffered a stroke on a Tuesday morning in April, discovered by a neighbor who noticed her newspaper still sitting untouched on the driveway well past her usual routine and, growing concerned, knocked on her door before calling for emergency help when nobody answered. She was taken to the regional hospital and diagnosed with a moderate ischemic stroke, affecting primarily the left side of her body and, in the initial days, her speech, though her doctors were cautiously optimistic, given her overall health and the relatively swift emergency response, about a meaningful, if gradual, recovery. I received the call from the hospital that same morning, listed, apparently, as my grandmother's emergency contact on paperwork from a routine appointment months earlier, a detail that struck me, once I learned it, as its own small, telling signal about how she'd already, quietly, positioned me relative to the rest of the family. I drove to the hospital immediately, arriving within the hour, and spent that first day in a state of genuine, disoriented fear, absorbing the specifics of her diagnosis alongside the particular, surreal strangeness of seeing a woman I'd always known as entirely, formidably capable, suddenly rendered so physically vulnerable. I called my mother from the hospital parking lot that same afternoon, relaying what I knew about my grandmother's condition, and I remember the specific, measured quality of her response, genuine concern, but delivered with a kind of careful emotional distance that struck me, even in the moment, as somewhat different from how I imagined most daughters might react to news of their own mother's stroke. She said she'd try to come by sometime this week, a phrase that, at the time, I took at face value, not yet understanding how literally, and how disappointingly, it would end up being fulfilled. I want to describe, as precisely as I can, what those first several days actually looked like, because the specific pattern that emerged during that stretch shaped everything that followed. I visited my grandmother daily, spending long stretches at her bedside, coordinating with her medical team, and gradually watching her regain small, incremental pieces of her speech and mobility as the days progressed. My mother visited once during that first week, a brief, roughly 45-minute visit on the third day, during which she seemed genuinely uncomfortable in the hospital environment, spending much of the visit checking her phone and making somewhat stilted conversation before explaining that she needed to get back for a work obligation. My Aunt Barbara called twice during that same week but did not make the 3-hour drive to visit in person, citing, each time, specific scheduling conflicts that prevented her from coming any sooner. My Aunt Susan, despite living the closest among the three, did not visit at all during that first week, communicating instead through brief text messages asking for updates, messages that, I noticed, tapered off in frequency as the week progressed. I remember the specific, growing sense of isolation I felt during those days, not just on my own behalf, but on my grandmother's, watching her ask, with a quiet, careful casualness that didn't fully disguise the hurt underneath it, whether her daughters had called or whether they might be planning to visit soon. I found myself, more than once during that stretch, offering gentle, softened explanations on my mother's and aunt's behalf, mentioning their busy schedules, their own responsibilities, explanations I delivered partly to protect my grandmother's feelings and partly, I think, because I wasn't yet ready to fully name, even to myself, exactly how thin and inadequate those explanations actually were. I want to describe one particular exchange from that first week in more detail, because it stayed with me longer than almost any other single moment during that stretch. On the third day, I called my Aunt Susan directly, hoping to gently encourage her, given how close she lived, to come by even briefly. She answered sounding harried, background noise suggesting she was in the middle of driving one of her kids somewhere, and when I explained that Grandma had been asking about her, she sighed audibly before responding. I know, Sophie, I know, she said. It's just been an absolute circus here this week. Jake's got his tournament, Emma's got a project due, and Mark's traveling for work, so it's genuinely just me managing everything. I promise I'll get there this weekend. I remember feeling a specific, quiet frustration listening to this list, not because any individual item was unreasonable, but because the cumulative effect, week after week, was a kind of permanent unavailability dressed up as a temporary scheduling problem. The weekend she'd promised came and went without a visit, followed by another phone call in which she cited a different, equally plausible-sounding obstacle. I didn't push back forcefully in the moment, partly out of my own conflict avoidance and partly because I genuinely didn't yet have the language to name what I was observing as a pattern rather than a series of unrelated, individually understandable delays. By the end of the first week, a clear, unmistakable pattern had settled into place. I was, in every practical sense, my grandmother's sole consistent presence and advocate throughout her hospitalization, while my mother and aunts maintained a kind of comfortable, minimal-effort distance, checking in periodically enough to maintain the appearance of appropriate concern without ever translating that concern into the kind of sustained, physical presence that a genuine medical crisis, involving their own mother, might reasonably have been expected to produce. I want to describe a specific conversation I had with my mother during this period, because it crystallized something I'd been circling around without fully naming. I called her, on the 5th day, to update her on my grandmother's continued gradual improvement, and mentioned, somewhat pointedly, that Grandma had been asking about her. My mother's response, delivered with a kind of practiced, faintly defensive ease, was that she was sure your grandmother understands that everyone has responsibilities, and that constant visiting wasn't necessarily the most helpful thing anyway, since my grandmother needed rest more than a rotating cast of visitors. I remember feeling a specific, sharp frustration at this explanation, not because I thought constant, exhausting visits from everyone would genuinely have been ideal, but because the framing conveniently obscured the actual reality of the situation. That constant visiting wasn't remotely the concern, given that my mother and aunts, combined, had produced barely 2 hours of total in-person presence across an entire week during which their own mother had suffered a genuinely serious medical event. I want to describe, in careful detail, the specific evening when everything in this story began to shift, because it remains one of the more significant nights of my adult life. It was the 4th night of my grandmother's hospitalization, and I'd stayed later than usual, the hospital room quiet and dim except for the low hum of her monitoring equipment, my grandmother drifting in and out of a light, medicated sleep as her body continued the slow, effortful work of early stroke recovery. I was preparing to leave for the night, gathering my things quietly so as not to wake her, when I felt her hand close around my wrist with a strength that genuinely surprised me, given how physically diminished she'd been throughout the preceding days. I turned back toward the bed and found her eyes open, alert in a way I hadn't seen since before the stroke, fixed directly on me with a specific, focused intensity. "Sophie," she said, her voice still carrying some of the slurred quality her speech therapy hadn't yet fully resolved, but clearer and more deliberate than anything she'd managed in days. "I need you to do something for me. Tonight, if you can manage it. Call my lawyer. Mr. Whitfield. His number's in my address book, at the house, in the kitchen drawer by the phone. Call him tonight and tell him what's happened. Tell him I need to speak with him as soon as possible. Before I die, Sophie. I mean that. Before I die." I want to describe the specific, complicated fear that gripped me in that moment, hearing my grandmother speak so plainly about her own mortality, a directness I wasn't emotionally prepared for despite everything we'd already been through during the preceding 4 days. I asked her, as gently as I could manage while my own hands were visibly shaking, whether she was in pain, whether something specific had changed medically that I needed to alert the nursing staff about. She shook her head, slowly but firmly, and gripped my wrist a little tighter. "This isn't about my health right now," she said. "This is about something else. Something I should have handled a long time ago, and I think this," she gestured, faintly, toward the hospital room around us, "has made me understand I can't keep putting it off. I need Mr. Whitfield. I need him to come see me, here, as soon as he can. Can you do this for me, Sophie? Tonight?" I told her, without hesitation, that of course I would, though I remember feeling, in that moment, a genuine uncertainty about exactly what I was actually agreeing to help arrange. I left the hospital that night and drove directly to her house, retrieving the address book from the kitchen drawer exactly where she'd said it would be, and found the entry for a Robert Whitfield, listed simply as attorney, with both an office number and, beneath it in my grandmother's careful handwriting, a personal cell phone number. I called the personal cell number first, given the late hour, uncertain whether reaching an attorney directly at nearly 10 in the evening was appropriate, but trusting my grandmother's clear, urgent instruction closely enough to try anyway. Robert Whitfield answered on the third ring, his voice carrying an immediate, focused alertness once I identified myself and explained the situation, that I was Eleanor Marsh's granddaughter, that she'd suffered a stroke 4 days earlier, and that she'd specifically, urgently asked me to contact him that same night. I remember the specific shift in his tone once I finished explaining the situation, a shift from the neutral, professional caution of someone unexpectedly receiving a late-night call from a stranger, into something considerably more focused and concerned. "I need to see her as soon as possible," he said. "Tomorrow morning, first thing, if the hospital will allow visitors that early. Can you meet me there at 8? I asked him, somewhat hesitantly, whether he could tell me anything about what this was regarding, genuinely uncertain, in the moment, whether I was overstepping some boundary by asking. He paused for a moment before responding, carefully. "I've represented your grandmother for almost 20 years, he said. "I can't discuss the specific details of our work together without her explicit permission, even with family. But I will tell you this much, your grandmother has mentioned, more than once over the years, a specific concern about exactly the kind of situation you've just described to me, a medical crisis, and how her family might respond to it. I think she's been anticipating this conversation for longer than you might realize." I arrived at the hospital the following morning slightly before 8, finding Robert Whitfield already waiting in the hallway outside my grandmother's room, a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s carrying a worn leather briefcase and a specific, calm gravity that I found immediately, quietly reassuring given everything else unfolding around us. We entered the room together, and I watched my grandmother's face brighten, genuinely, at the sight of him, a specific, warm recognition considerably different from the careful, guarded expressions she'd worn throughout most of her hospitalization thus far. "Robert," she said, her voice still slightly slurred but carrying real clarity of purpose. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because it represented the beginning of a conversation I wasn't initially certain I was meant to be present for. My grandmother, noticing my hesitation near the door, gestured for me to stay. "Sophie can hear this," she said to Robert. "In fact, I think it's important that she does." Robert nodded, pulled a chair close to the bed, and opened his briefcase, retrieving a folder I noticed was labeled, in neat, typed print, with my grandmother's full name and a specific case number. Over the following half hour, my grandmother, with Robert's careful, patient assistance filling in details her still recovering speech occasionally struggled to fully articulate, explained something I hadn't previously known anything about, that she had, in fact, worked with Robert over the preceding several years to establish a comprehensive, carefully structured estate plan, one that included specific, detailed provisions she'd developed with a clear-eyed, deliberate awareness of exactly the pattern of family involvement, or lack of it, that had characterized her relationship with her 3 children for years. "I've watched this pattern for a long time, Sophie," she told me, her hand finding mine again with the same firm grip from the previous night. "Your mother and your aunts, they love me, in their own way, I believe that. But love without presence isn't something I've been willing to keep rewarding equally, the way most parents feel obligated to. I made some decisions, a few years back, about how I wanted things structured, once I'm gone. This past week, watching who actually showed up and who didn't, only confirmed what I'd already suspected." Robert, at this point, explained, with my grandmother's explicit permission, the broader shape of what she'd established, a will that divided her estate unequally among her 3 children and me, weighted specifically toward reflecting the actual pattern of care and involvement each of us had demonstrated over recent years, alongside a specific, detailed letter, prepared in advance and held in Robert's office, explaining her reasoning in her own words, intended to be read by the family after her eventual death. I want to describe something else Robert mentioned during this same conversation, a detail that stayed with me long after that particular hospital visit ended. He explained that my grandmother had, roughly 3 years earlier, written a personal letter, sealed and kept in his office alongside the formal legal documents, addressed individually to each of her 3 daughters and to me, intended to be opened only after her death, laying out in her own words, considerably more personal and less legal than the will itself, her reasoning and her feelings about the choices she'd made. "She's updated portions of that letter twice since first writing it," Robert told me, glancing toward my grandmother for confirmation before continuing. "Most recently about 8 months ago. I think, given everything that's happened this week, she may want to revise it again, and I'd encourage her to consider doing so once she's feeling up to it, so that whatever she ultimately wants each of you to understand reflects her most current, complete thinking rather than an earlier version that may not fully capture everything she's now experienced." My grandmother nodded slowly at this, her expression carrying a specific, tired resolve. "I think you're right, Robert," she said. "I want to add something about this week specifically. Not out of spite. I just think honesty matters more to me now than it perhaps did when I first wrote it, when all of this still felt somewhat hypothetical rather than something I'd actually lived through firsthand." I asked my grandmother, gently, why this specific crisis had prompted her to call Robert so urgently, given that the underlying estate plan, from what she'd just described, had apparently already been in place for some time. She explained, with a specific, weary clarity, that the stroke had made her confront something she'd been avoiding, the possibility that she might not have as much remaining time as she'd assumed, and a related, specific concern that had been building throughout the preceding difficult week. "I want to update a few things," she said. "Watching this past week unfold exactly the way I'd expected it might, if I'm honest with myself, has made me want to be even more specific and clear about what I'm doing and why, rather than leaving as much room for anyone to contest or misunderstand my intentions after I'm gone. I also want to make some immediate changes, Robert, regarding who has authority to make decisions on my behalf if something happens to me before we can finish updating everything properly." Robert explained, at this point, that my grandmother wanted to formally update her healthcare power of attorney and financial power of attorney, both of which, apparently, had previously named my mother as the primary decision-maker, a designation my grandmother now wanted changed, specifically, to name me instead, given what she described, plainly, as the clear, demonstrated pattern of who could actually be relied upon during a genuine crisis. I want to describe honestly how I felt, hearing all of this laid out so plainly, because it wasn't a simple, uncomplicated feeling. There was a genuine, significant relief in understanding that my grandmother had, in fact, been thinking carefully and deliberately about her own future and protection, rather than simply being as vulnerable and unprotected as the preceding week's family absence had made me fear. But there was also a specific, uncomfortable weight to suddenly understanding that I was being positioned, formally and legally, at the center of decisions that would inevitably create real tension with my mother and aunts, once they eventually learned about the changes being discussed. I asked my grandmother, directly, whether she was certain about this, whether she'd considered how my mother and aunts might react to learning that decision-making authority had been shifted specifically to me rather than remaining with my mother, her oldest child, as it apparently had been for years prior. She looked at me with a specific, steady clarity that I recognized, even through the physical toll of her stroke, as unmistakably her own characteristic directness. "I've considered it carefully," she said. "I'm not doing this to punish anyone, Sophie, whatever it might look like from the outside. I'm doing this because when I actually needed someone, this past week, there was exactly one person who showed up, every single day, without my having to ask twice. I think that fact should matter, in how I structure decisions about my own care and my own future. I don't think that's unreasonable, and I don't think you should feel guilty about it either." I asked Robert, once my grandmother had drifted into a brief rest later that same afternoon, how long he'd actually known her, curious about the depth of trust that clearly existed between them. He told me he'd first represented her almost 20 years earlier, helping her negotiate the sale of one of her dry cleaning locations, and had continued handling her legal affairs steadily ever since, watching her navigate decisions about the business, then retirement, then, gradually, estate planning as she'd grown older. "I've watched a lot of families go through exactly this kind of reckoning," he told me quietly, in the hallway outside her room. "It's rarely about money, in the end, whatever it might look like on paper. It's about people finally being honest, out loud, about who actually shows up. Your grandmother isn't a vindictive woman, Sophie. I've known her a long time. This is the most direct I've ever seen her be about any of this, and I think that directness is coming from somewhere real, not anger, but a kind of clarity that a health scare like this one tends to force on people." I told him I appreciated hearing that, admitting that some part of me had worried, over the preceding days, whether I was somehow taking advantage of my grandmother's vulnerable state by remaining so involved in these conversations. Robert shook his head firmly. "She asked for you specifically to be here," he said. "That was her decision, made with full clarity about what she was doing. Don't spend energy worrying about a manipulation that isn't happening." Over the following 2 days, Robert Whitfield returned to the hospital with the necessary paperwork, and my grandmother, working through the physical difficulty of signing documents with a hand still recovering from the stroke's effects, formally updated her healthcare power of attorney and financial power of attorney to name me as her primary decision-maker, with a specific, detailed provision explaining that this change reflected her deliberate, considered assessment of who had demonstrated genuine, reliable presence during a period of real medical crisis. I want to describe the specific weight of witnessing this process, understanding, even as it unfolded, that these weren't simply administrative formalities, but genuine, significant decisions with real, lasting consequences for how our family's dynamics would likely shift once they became known more broadly. Robert, sensing some of my continued unease during this process, spoke with me privately afterward, explaining that in his considerable experience handling exactly these kinds of situations, families often benefited, ultimately, from this kind of clear, documented honesty about actual patterns of care, however uncomfortable the immediate consequences of that honesty might be. "Your grandmother isn't doing anything unusual here," he told me. "I've seen this exact pattern play out many times over the years, an aging parent who's watched, quietly, which children actually show up consistently and which children maintain distance, and who eventually decides, often prompted by exactly the kind of crisis your grandmother just experienced, that their formal legal arrangements should reflect that reality rather than simply defaulting to birth order or some abstract, unexamined assumption of equal treatment regardless of actual involvement." I knew, once the formal changes had been finalized, that I needed to inform my mother directly, rather than allowing her to learn about the shift in decision-making authority through some more indirect, potentially more painful route. I called her the following week, once my grandmother had stabilized enough to be discharged to a rehabilitation facility for continued recovery, and explained, as plainly and gently as I could manage, what had happened during those crucial days at the hospital. I remember my mother's initial reaction being one of genuine, visible shock, quickly followed by a defensive anger that I'd anticipated but that still landed with real emotional force. "She did this without even talking to me first," my mother said. "I'm her daughter, Sophie. Her oldest daughter. This should have been a conversation with me, not something decided behind my back while I was dealing with a million other things." I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that from what I understood, this hadn't actually been decided behind her back in the way she was characterizing it, but rather represented a response, however difficult to hear, to a specific pattern of behavior that had played out clearly and undeniably over the preceding week. I didn't say this to be cruel, but because I genuinely believed, by that point, that continuing to soften or obscure the underlying reality wasn't serving anyone well, including my mother herself. About 2 weeks after my grandmother's discharge to the rehabilitation facility, Robert Whitfield arranged a formal family meeting at his office, at my grandmother's specific request, to discuss the updated arrangements directly and transparently with my mother and both aunts present, rather than allowing the situation to continue unfolding through fragmented, second-hand conversations. I want to describe the specific tension of that meeting, held in a conference room at Robert's office with my grandmother, still using a cane and moving with noticeably careful deliberation following her stroke, seated at the head of the table. My mother and my Aunt Susan arrived together, having apparently spoken extensively beforehand, their expressions carrying a specific, aligned wariness. My Aunt Barbara arrived separately, having driven the 3 hours specifically for this meeting, a detail I noted with some private, complicated irony given how she hadn't made that same drive during her mother's actual hospitalization weeks earlier. My grandmother opened the meeting herself, her speech considerably clearer by this point than it had been in the hospital, though still carrying some residual effects of the stroke. "I asked you all here," she said, "because I think it's important you hear directly from me, not through Sophie, not through rumors, exactly what I've decided and why. I'm not interested in assigning blame or having an argument about this. I simply want to be honest with all of you, the way I should have been, perhaps, years ago, about how I've been experiencing this family's patterns." My grandmother proceeded, over the following 20 minutes, to lay out, with a specific, measured directness I found both difficult to witness and genuinely admirable, exactly the pattern she'd observed, not just during her recent hospitalization, but over several preceding years, of gradually diminishing contact and involvement from her 3 daughters, contrasted plainly against the consistent, sustained presence I'd provided throughout that same period, and especially during the acute crisis of her stroke. "I want to be clear that I don't think any of you are bad daughters, fundamentally," she told them. "I think you're all busy, and I think old family tensions, some of them going back decades, have made it easier for all 3 of you to maintain distance than to work through whatever's actually causing that distance. But I'm 83 years old, and I just had a stroke that could have easily killed me. I don't have the luxury of waiting around for everyone to eventually work through their feelings on their own timeline. I needed to make decisions based on the reality I've actually observed, not the reality I might wish existed." I watched my Aunt Susan's face during this explanation, a specific mixture of defensiveness and, gradually, something closer to genuine discomfort, as my grandmother continued, calmly, to describe specific instances, the single, brief hospital visit, the tapering text messages, the pattern extending back well before the stroke itself, into years of holidays attended briefly and dutifully rather than with any real, sustained warmth or presence. My mother's reaction, once my grandmother finished speaking, carried a specific, raw quality that surprised me somewhat, given her more defensive tone during our earlier phone conversation. "I don't have a good excuse," she said, quietly, after a long pause. "I've told myself for years that you didn't really want or need me around that much, given how independent you've always been. I think it was easier to believe that than to actually examine why I kept finding reasons to stay away. My Aunt Barbara, for her part, acknowledged the 3-hour distance as a genuine practical obstacle but conceded, with visible difficulty, that she likely could have made more effort during the actual hospitalization than the 2 brief phone calls she'd ultimately managed. My Aunt Susan remained more defensive throughout much of the discussion, pointing repeatedly to her own household obligations, though even she, by the meeting's end, acknowledged, in a more subdued tone than she'd started with, that 40 minutes away hadn't been nearly as significant an obstacle as she'd been telling herself it was throughout that difficult week. I want to be honest that I didn't feel any particular satisfaction watching this difficult reckoning unfold, despite everything that had led up to it. What I felt, mostly, was a quiet, complicated grief on my grandmother's behalf, understanding more fully than I had before exactly how long she must have been quietly absorbing this specific pattern of distance from her own children, long before her stroke finally forced the whole family to confront it directly and openly. I don't want to describe what happened in the months following that meeting as some complete, instant transformation in how my mother and aunts related to my grandmother, because that wouldn't be honest. Old patterns, particularly ones reinforced over years or even decades, don't dissolve simply because they've been named plainly in a lawyer's conference room. But something specific and genuinely meaningful did shift. My mother began visiting my grandmother regularly at the rehabilitation facility, and later, once she returned home with some additional in-home support, at the house itself, visits that started, I think, from a place of genuine guilt but that gradually, over subsequent months, seemed to develop into something closer to authentic reconnection, the 2 of them slowly working through some of the older, unspoken tension that had shaped their relationship for years before any of this began. My Aunt Barbara established a more consistent pattern of monthly visits despite the distance, along with considerably more frequent phone calls than her previous, sparse pattern of contact. My Aunt Susan's shift was more gradual and, I think, still somewhat incomplete, though she did begin visiting more regularly than before, even as her own busy household continued to limit how much she could realistically offer. People who hear this story sometimes assume my grandmother must have been motivated primarily by anger or a desire for some kind of dramatic reckoning with her daughters, engineering the whole situation as a calculated punishment for years of relative neglect. I don't think that's accurate, based on everything I witnessed directly throughout this experience. What I saw, instead, was a woman responding, with real clarity and remarkably little bitterness given the circumstances, to a pattern she'd observed plainly and had simply, finally, decided to acknowledge honestly in how she structured her own affairs, rather than continuing to pretend it wasn't happening. What I learned, watching this entire situation unfold, is that sometimes the people we love most clearly see patterns in our behavior that we ourselves haven't fully examined or acknowledged, and that a genuine crisis, a stroke, a hospitalization, any moment that strips away the comfortable, low-stakes distance many families operate within, has a specific way of making those patterns undeniable, both to the person experiencing them and, eventually, to everyone else forced to reckon with the consequences. I don't think my mother or my aunts set out, years ago, to become the kind of daughters who'd leave their own mother largely alone during a serious medical crisis. I think, like a lot of families navigating old tension and ordinary busyness simultaneously, they'd each, independently, settled into a pattern of minimal involvement that felt, from the inside, considerably more reasonable and justified than it actually was, a pattern that only became fully visible once someone with the standing and the courage to do so, my grandmother herself, decided to name it plainly and respond to it honestly. My grandmother continues her recovery today, nearly a year after her stroke, walking with only a slight residual limp and speaking with a clarity that belies how uncertain those first difficult days in the hospital genuinely were. Our family, while still imperfect and still working through old patterns that don't fully dissolve overnight, looks noticeably different than it did before that specific week, more present, more honest, considerably less willing, I think, to let quiet distance masquerade as an acceptable substitute for genuine care. I still think often about that 4th night in the hospital, my grandmother's hand gripping my wrist with a strength I hadn't expected, her voice carrying a clarity and urgency that cut through everything else happening around us in that quiet, dim room. I've come to understand that moment not as some dramatic, calculated act of retribution against my mother and aunts, but as something considerably more honest and, in its own way, more moving, An 83-year-old woman, having just survived something that could easily have killed her, finally deciding that the people around her deserved the truth about what she'd actually observed, rather than continuing to spare everyone's feelings at the cost of her own genuine needs. If you've ever been the one who showed up, consistently, while others found reasons not to, I'd love to hear how that pattern eventually became visible to everyone else involved, and what changed once it did. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.